Hello, everyone. My name is Raj Bhatt, and we are attending today the session number ENT 327, Automate Compliance for Mission-Critical SAP Workloads like Lily. This is a 300-level session, so we expect audience to know what SAP is, how AWS services operate for SAP workloads, and everything is about compliance in today's session. As we go through this session today, I would like you to imagine the use cases that we are sharing today, and those could be applied not only for SAP workloads, but also for other ERP or non-SAP workloads to maintain your compliance needs on AWS. Along with me, I also have Ryan Weaver, who is a Senior Director at Lily for ERP platforms, and he's going to share their Lily transformation journey for SAP workloads that they are migrating from on-prem to S/4HANA on AWS. And as part of that, we'll be also sharing some design consideration that actually lead to the technical architectures and solutions that we have built for Lily. So what we're going to cover today is, of course, the Lily's ERP transformation program, what they're trying to do with SAP, with AWS, what were the design considerations that I have thought about that actually lead to the solution. We'll be talking a lot on the technical architectures, the pattern that actually helps us out to build this solution, grid branching, automated continuous compliance process, operations automation solutions, and finally the lessons learned and what Lily would be doing in future as part of their journey, which will be shared by Ryan. With that, I would like to actually let Ryan talk about Lily and their program. Ryan?
Great. Thank you, Raj, and good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a great re:Invent so far. My name is Ryan Weaver, and I have technical responsibility for Lily's SAP platform. Lily is a global life sciences company founded over 146 years ago on quality and innovation. And our mission is to create new innovative medicines for people around the world. And like many of you, we operate in a highly regulated environment. So today, Raj and I are going to share with you how we've been able to leverage native AWS services to automate technical compliance for our mission-critical SAP system. But first, I want to share a little bit about our transformation journey from an SAP perspective. So at Lily, we've been running SAP for over 25 years. And we run a single global instance that's hosted on-prem in our global data center, corporate data center. And in January of 2021, we launched a 3-year program to migrate from ECC to S/4HANA and to move to cloud on AWS. Now, some of the key drivers for our migration, our transformation were first of all, alignment with SAP's direction and strategy for the platform, where they'll be delivering new innovations. Also, how could we take advantage of the power of the cloud, and not just from a scalability perspective, but again, looking to take advantage of innovative services that are being created, like we're hearing about this week at re:Invent. And then finally, improving our end user experience with SAP's new Fiori user interface. In terms of outcomes, we expect to see a simplification of a number of business processes. We'll be taking advantage of embedded analytics, as well as modern visualization tools to really run our business in a more near real-time fashion than what we do today. We also are expecting to improve on our customer, vendor, and employee self-service experiences as we look to leverage innovations in AI for such as RPA and chatbots. And then lastly, just an overall reduction in our end user training with a more intuitive user interface. Next, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of our design considerations. First of all, what is our cloud strategy at Lily? We have a hybrid multi-cloud strategy, and we look for opportunities where we can exploit the power of the cloud to drive competitive advantage. In terms of automation, we have a big corporate strategy around automation as we are in a growth period today. We're looking to leverage automation to kind of maintain our size while we grow as a business. With SAP being mission critical at Lilly for our supply chain, manufacturing, and finance operations, we wanted to improve on the resiliency that we have today on-prem. And then from a security perspective, how should we think about things differently operating in the cloud? What are some of the guardrails that we need to have in place, and how do we just improve the overall security posture for our SAP platform? We're also looking to reduce our technical debt with some of the third-party tools that we rely on today by leveraging native AWS services wherever possible. And then we also had to take a step back and think about our operating model, right? What needs to change with us operating SAP in the cloud, getting alignment with our enterprise infrastructure teams as we seek more autonomy in how we run our SAP system. How can we move faster to meet the needs of the business and increase kind of our speed to value? We're now able to deliver an HA SAP system in under 2 hours with our systems on demand capability that would normally take 2 to 4 weeks via the manual process that we have today. And then finally, compliance, which is what we're here to talk about today. We had to think differently about compliance and how, as we transition to more infrastructure as code with our SAP platform, how should we think differently about compliance? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Raj, and he is going to dive much, much deeper into the services, the native services that we've used to build out our S/4HANA solution on AWS.
Thank you so much, Ryan. So the exciting time comes now, and we are going to talk about a lot of different AWS services here. What I would like to focus on this particular slide is how we are using AWS config service to automatically put the right controls and guide rails that you as a customer doesn't have to manage, right? What Confirm is Pack does, it actually has a list of 200 to 300 controls that you can actually pick and choose, implement that on an AWS account, and that automatically puts those controls for the right services. One less thing to worry about. Now, everything starts with some kind of framework, right? So what we have done here is we have defined all the input parameters in a phase called input, of course, which identifies, okay, what type of SAP systems that needs to be deployed, what are the requirements on the tags, what the firewalls rules would be. And those CSV files as an inputs are the kind of a first stage of the framework, right? Once you have those documented, right, it actually ends up in a GitHub repository, and those becomes the driving factor to build that environment. There is no human touch between providing this input parameters up to launching an SAP system, testing it, validating it, bringing it up to a high availability configuration, right? The second phase is a prepare phase. This is where all the foundational services required to launch an SAP systems are built. Again, even at this phase, we haven't even launched an EC2 instance yet. What we are trying to do here is for each and every SAP environment, we are creating the required services to operate that SAP environment in a controlled manner. Once the prepare phase is over, we have a security groups, we have security group rules launched with the right configuration that are defined in a CSV file. That's where the deploy phase comes in, right? And in the deploy phase, what happens, all the parameters that were inserted, updating the DynamoDB table, are consumed by these various AWS services that triggers the CloudFormation templates or triggers services like step function or state machines to perfectly complete the SAP install orchestration events, right? We are going to do a deep dive on this framework that will help you understand how AWS services can actually operate in this kind of a regulated manner and reduce the amount of time it takes from compliance perspective to generate the IQ reports, installation qualification, or OQ reports, manually, right? So what are the design components? What is under the hood of this SDF or SAP System Deployment Framework? We use code pipeline as a starting point. There are various code pipelines. I'm not going to do a deep dive on all of them, but just to give you an idea, there is an account level code pipeline that is actually set up once manually per account. Once that account level code pipeline is set up, there are various other code pipelines that will be triggered automatically based on what you have wrote, what you have committed in the GitHub, right? And this would be environments like development, QA, production, or DR, right? And once those environment level code pipelines are built, there are system level code pipelines, and this is where those EC2 instances, EBS volumes, and everything is getting configured. Now, the orchestration tool or orchestrator tool of choice that we have selected is a state machine or step function, which actually handles all the logic required to configure the operating system, configure the database, install SAP system, set up HA, perform some checks, verification checks, and so on and so forth. And that use case, as I said earlier, is very convenient to use. It is actually an API-driven calls that we actually perform to other AWS services to do some lot of meaningful tasks. Diving into an account level code pipeline, because this is where the solution is actually evolved, right? The account level code pipeline is launched through a manual step, as I said earlier. There are only 2 CloudFormation templates that is actually building this code pipeline. We set up those manually. We register those with the GitHub. So GitHub Enterprise has a feature called a web URL, right? So you set up those with the AWS code pipeline. And that's the one-time setup that allows customers now to seamlessly integrate the GitHub or your source repository with the AWS account to do some meaningful things. Once that is done, of course, the way account level code pipeline execution works, it reads those config files. So remember the input phase we talked about earlier? One of the input parameters are how that SAP environment should look like. Which AWS account I want to launch my development application or development environment, or do you really want to enable that code pipeline right now? Because I still have 6 months before I'm going to deploy my QA. So those are the flags that you can enable or disable to launch or just have those parameters staged for your future needs. Similar to account level code pipeline, also there is a GitHub integration. And this is where, as we talked about earlier, there are 2 additional code pipelines that will be deployed. One for managing the SAP environment, right? And the other one is all the system build code pipelines. All right, so let's do a deep dive on the environment code pipeline, right? Again, we have a GitHub as a starting repository where all these source codes are managed. And that actually triggers a code commit event, which is an automated process. We already have registered that with the GitHub Enterprise server. The code commit understands what changes happen. It triggers the AWS code build process. This is where the fun begins. It actually has a lot of logic that actually helps us understand which environments I need to launch, right? It does a code check. So if there are any errors in the code, formatting errors, it will identify and flag that specific piece of merge request. So even before we have launched the SAP environment, we can capture problems like formatting errors or in CloudFormation template, or if you wrote a Python program, it will also capture those errors using standard open source repository tools. Once that build process completes, which takes no less than 2 minutes, it bakes that entire code, which is verified, to an S3 bucket location, right? Why we are doing that? From S3, CloudFormation as a service will pull those templates in, and it will try to launch the server the way it should look like, right? Now, of course, we cannot let automation take over everything, right? And this is where the manual approval process is introduced. So what if somebody have decided to launch a 6 terabyte instance, but the requirement is only to launch 3? This is where the code reviewer or architects will have the opportunity to review what is getting merged, whether that's the right configuration that we want or not, and reject that request right before anything happens to that environment. The next step is AWS Code Deploy. Now, this service is powerful enough to handle calls to Lambda functions or to services like CloudFormation and perform a lot of other actions, right? Now, part of the problem that we are solving here is it actually triggers a lot of Lambda functions. And these Lambda functions are, has a lot of verification steps baked into it. Excuse me. So if you're doing an import function for tags, right? So these tags are basically a cost allocation tags or mandatory tags that your organization will require on any AWS services that you would be launching, right? And if those tags are missing, an important one is cost allocation, which is very useful for doing a cross charge. The Lambda function will fail and notify the operator saying, we are missing some mandatory tags, right? The other thing is, of course, generating SAP passwords. So this is where we use SAP like a program that actually generates a password in Python and then uploads that password to services like SSM Parameter Store or Secrets Manager, which is actually used by a step function later on while installing SAP, right? And then, of course, the second part of Code Deploy is to launch the actual services, right? Again, we are still in deploy phase. We haven't launched an SAP server yet. What we're doing here is creating that foundational services required to launch an SAP environment. Now, rather than going through all the slides and showing the pretty pictures, we wanted to share the actual execution of the system code pipeline, right? So what is happening here, I mean, now we are familiar, there's a code build process, code deploy process, there's a check, there's a step that actually uploads everything into S3 bucket. Everything happens in a matter of minutes with the compliance checks baked into our code, right? And finally, what I would like to also share with you is some of the features that we actually are using from CloudFormation that allows you to not even write a single line of code for services that you would be launching, right? Giving an example, you have EFS file systems that are required for SAP. You don't want to go ahead and find out you have 50 systems. I have to write, I don't know, 200 line of code in CloudFormation to define all those EFS file systems. What you can do is you can use service feature called transform function within CloudFormation template that allows you to do a lookup to a single source of truth, kind of a DynamoDB database, which has a list of all the systems, which knows what kind of EFS file systems are required for which application. And the way it operates, it actually provides that feedback back to CloudFormation template as a pre-baked resource configuration, right? So rather than you as a developer or you as an SME writing that code, CloudFormation as a service will allow you to write that code and scale in and scale out those code as well. So eventually, if you decide to drop, say, a bunch of SAP application, you don't have to go ahead and update that CloudFormation template. It automatically identifies that, hey, we don't have that system anymore in DynamoDB table, and this is how the new configuration will look like. So this magic we're using a lot for a lot of other tasks as well. So ENI is another one, right? So SAP system needs specific IP addresses or list of IP addresses on one server. And in SAP world, we call it as virtual host names, right? So one SAP EC2 instance may have multiple IP addresses that defines how that application should look like. And that is also manipulated by a transform service. And it makes a call to DynamoDB table. It understands that, hey, we have this big set of 20 SAP servers, and it tries to identify 20 ENIs, provides that resource definition back to CloudFormation, and that's how the things are getting launched. Now, that call itself, as we can see on the screen, it happens in 1 minute, 15 seconds. So imagine you would be writing a code for that rather than just use that service switcher, which is pretty powerful. Again, try to think about the use cases that could be beneficial for the task that you will be performing. Final step on this one is the state machine executions. So we have a Lambda function that reads all this great input values and parameters that has been defined in DynamoDB table, and that actually launches the SAP server. Until here, again, we haven't introduced any services yet that provides a significant cost to the customer, right? So here we are just preparing this all environments. Now let's do a deep dive into state machine, right? Again, why I'm sharing this all things is because you will understand the entire flow of the SAP deployment framework and how compliance plays an important role in the end, right? Imagine these tasks that are actually done manually right now, how much time is getting wasted, or where those resources are utilizing their time, right? It would be much powerful if we can automate the steps, especially around process and procedures that could be driven by the automation, right? And this all are event-based triggers, right? It's not somebody doing a click in AWS console or writing something on the AWS CLI, right? It's all driven by GitHub. So finally, state machines, right? So state machine, there's single state machine for every SAP system that identifies how many SAP servers it has in that system, right? And it's very straightforward, right? The Lambda function kicks in, provides the input saying, I want to launch my development XYZ environment. Of course, XYZ is not a SID, let's say DV, right? And what this state machine does, it does again a DynamoDB lookup to find out, okay, I have to deploy this development environment. How many servers are there? What type of deployment it is? Whether it's a distributed, hybrid build stack, or is it a standard build, right? And based on that, it tries to launch additional state machines for that specific use cases. So if those are app servers, or if those are DB2 databases or HANA databases, that's the logic that is baked into the state machines, right? Now, things get crazier after this as well. And I don't want you to focus on all these steps here. What I would like to focus you on is how we are actually interacting with other AWS services to do some meaningful things. So one of the requirements that we had is to populate an S3 file with something called KS input parameters. It's where operating system team or platform team comes in, utilizes those information to configure the operating system, right? And that's where the OS qualification takes place. Lilly already have developed that service and that offering through their service providers. Rather than we from SAP team inventing those things, we leverage that capability. The way we actually do that is, of course, utilizing Lambda functions and making that call within the state machine as a task, populating those required parameters, creating that S3 file, and staging that on S3 bucket, right? So a very good use case. I mean, you can do this for several other initiatives as well. If you need to create your environment-specific configuration before application comes in, you can do that through this kind of integration. And same way, there are other things that we do, like, okay, what type of host it is, how many EBS volume I have to attach, what is the size of that EBS volume? That's actually, again, a Lambda lookup to the DynamoDB table to understand that SAP server specification, and it actually provides that value back to a state machine, which is used by other activities that are listed here, right? The next step is, of course, the actual launch of SAP server. And this is where the fun begins in terms of launching EC2 with the right EBS configuration. That's where the initialization happens, right? Once the EC2 as a service is launched, we start the actual configuration of SAP environment. We use something called State Machine Activity Worker. Have anybody used State Machine Activity Worker before? All right, so let me give you a little more background. These are the scripts that you have wrote, like a Python script that gets some kind of input parameters, does something on OS, and provides the result back. What State Machine Activity Worker from Step Function does, it can listen to an HTTPS-based request from a state machine activity, and it could have a lot of input parameters. It can get that task token from state machine, perform the task, and provide us results, whether it's a success or failure, back to state machine. So if you want to do certain things at the OS level and you're confined with the compliance boundaries that you're not allowed to use SSM agents, right? These are the mechanisms that could help you out to still take the advantage of the services like State Machine Activity Worker to do certain meaningful things. Why I'm sharing this? Because we did face this challenge initially at Lilly, right? Where SSM was not allowed. We had to work with various teams to get that SSM service allowed for SAP. Because of the transformation program that we were in, we cannot wait for that to happen. And this mechanism helped us to keep on building the servers without pausing our program. And as we can see on the screen, there are a lot of other things that happens in the state machine execution. So you have OS configuration, you have configuration for the database installs. Once that is done, you may have other state machines that might be needed to be launched. This is where high availability configuration comes in. So we performed the SAP install, we completed the SAP build, and then we now are doing an HA configuration. So here, this is where we set the course a little differently. SSM got certified, we started using SSM, and the way we started using it, we had SDK integrations, right? Which was certified and available in the state machine, which we're able to make a call to EC2 service directly, right? That simplifies the overall setup, the high availability configuration, because now we are not relying on state machine activity workers or Python scripts that we were staging previously. Now with that, SDK integration, there are a lot of other things that you could do. And in this case, it was all about how do you configure high availability configuration and how do you interact with services natively using state machine. All right, so that completes the entire launch sequence of how we install SAP, right? The fun part begins like how do we control this massive code repository that we have developed, right? And how do we control the updates or enhancements that we do between the environments, like from dev to QA to prod? That's where we define Git branching and merging strategies. It's a little different than a traditional web application that we all are familiar with. And we thought that it would be very beneficial to share this. We are all aware of development branches. We carve out a feature, we work on it, we merge it to the release branch. And once all the release branch is done, there might be some features that we introduce right in the release branch, and we release that as a kind of a tag release for a specific sprint cycle. Now, where the things get interesting in SAP workload, you cannot just merge all the features from main branch to all the SAP environment at once, because any changes that you introduce in dev also impacts QA, production, and so on and so forth. What has been done here is we have a specific webhook attached to a branch for a specific SAP environment. What that does, it actually triggers the update only to that SAP environment. So all the testing is done in the sandbox first, and if we verify the changes are good, then we go ahead and merge that request to other SAP environment. So that's where the compliance comes in, control comes in, and the guide rail comes in to maintain this kind of environment. So the other thing is, of course, you do this all magic. How do we verify that the HA systems are configured correctly? How do we verify that instance numbers are set correctly? Do we have the right UIDs or not? And that's where the continuous compliance solution comes in, right? These are also event-based triggers. So once state machine completes the task, automated continuous compliance solution kicks in and tries to look into all the configuration that were staged on EC2 or on AWS service level, generates a report whether those are done correctly or not, right? And the way it actually does that is, of course, you have AWS Event Bridge listening for a successful state machine execution, and then it runs several SSM automation commands, tries to compare those variables with what that variable should be, and then generates a report which is stored in S3 as a mutable, immutable store, right? What it happens is like it actually provides a lot of consistency in the build process, saves significant time, and it's an event-driven, so there's no need to do an ad hoc execution every time when you build an SAP system. And it actually keeps compliance in check, right? This is just a report that is actually generated out of this compliance solution. And so one of the things is a run instance check. So you want to make sure that your EC2 is having that right run instance code. It also has checks for AMI. So if you have launched an SAP system with pretty old AMIs, it will also set that as a flag saying it's using very old AMI. Again, it's event-based, automated. It actually has an versioning enabled, and it keeps the compliance in check. There are a lot of SAP operations automation solutions that Lily is also leveraging. So they started with stop and start automation, where we leverage SSM parameters, SSM documents. There are backup management tools. So again, we are using SSM automation documents to take backups of HANA as well as DB2 databases. Then we have a password rotation, which is what we are working next year, that will allow us to rotate the operating system level password automatically using Secrets Manager as a starting point. Backup and restores are done through AWS Backup Service. And this is where it periodically tries to look for how many EBS volumes are there or EFS file systems are there and performs the backup, stores it in the backup vault. And finally, we're looking into enhancing the monitoring capabilities through CloudWatch App Insights. Recently, AWS announced a use of SAP NetWeaver monitoring capabilities using App Insights, something that would be on the radar as well. What are the benefits for doing operations automation, right? So in compliance world, there are two major things. One is the qualification piece, and second thing is the validation piece. Qualification is something that you need to generate an IR for. You have to keep those recorded somewhere. But when it comes to validating a process, that's the kind of a heavy lifting because your SAP systems are already live, and any changes that you introduce on that system requires a lot of documented trail. Operations automation solutions will allow you to generate that audit trail automatically, what change, who performed that change, and it will document the old things within AWS services, so you can go in and audit those executions. And especially from stop and start perspective, it's not only allowing you to just keep the cost down, but you can use those features to perform regular maintenance activities, month-end activities to gracefully stop your SAP system, let OS team perform the patches, and bring those systems up, right? So a lot of use cases and advantages on that. Transparency is very important one as well. If things are not working, it's better it doesn't work everywhere rather than working in this one environment. So when you introduce automation solutions, it maintains that consistency across your landscape. If things are not done well in Sandbox and it was identified in QA, we know it is actually wrong across the board, which is easier to fix rather than trying to compare the environments, right? And of course, improves operational efficiency. Things that we have been doing in the past, we can actually focus on more meaningful tasks rather than just waking up every Monday or during the weekend, perform the task, and then forget about it, right? With that, I would actually like to invite Ryan to talk about the SAP on AWS journey. What is the plan for 2023? Ryan?
Thank you, Raj, and thank you for your partnership in getting us to this point in our journey. Let's see here. Okay, so I mentioned in 2021 is when we formally kicked off our program, and we're now well past our halfway point. Initially, we had a lot of focus on design and discovery sessions. We built out our initial deployment framework, and then ultimately provided our functional teams with a sandbox environment to begin unit testing in S/4HANA. As we moved into 2022, this has been a very, very productive year for us, I would say. We delivered our development environment and launched into our informal integration testing across our different towers, and we did this throughout the year this year. We also hit a major milestone here just earlier this month with the formal qualification of our platform. So this is a really big milestone. It sets the way for 2023 as we begin building out those high availability quality systems to get into formal testing cycles. And then in addition to that, we did the final release of our current ECC system earlier this month, and we'll now enter into a safeguarding period for the next 14 months or so, where we'll only be introducing legal and regulatory type changes into our environment. We also, this is very, very important point, is that we launched a formal cloud fluency program across our teams, right? Initially in the first year, we were limited to a few folks that were involved in the project, still had today to support. And so this year was really about bringing the rest of the program and the rest of the team on board. We had a number of role-based classes and things of that nature. We did bi-weekly skills camps, jam sessions, game day sessions, things of that nature. Very well received. Obviously, this is a journey. You see, this goes on through 2023, and this will continue to be an area of focus for us. And then as we look ahead to 2023, early in the year, we will build out those formal systems that we're going to be doing our functional testing as well as our performance testing. So that's going to be another key area of focus for us as we look ahead to our go live. We'll do a number of cutover practices, as this is much different than a cutover than a typical cutover for us. We do normally 2 releases a year, one more technical and one more functional, but this one is going to be a cutover on steroids, if you will. And then late in 2023, we will move our satellite systems into AWS in advance of our cutover window, which is we have a 72-hour window in February of 2024, where we will actually go live with S4HANA on AWS. So next, I want to just transition to some lessons learned, a few things that we've learned along the way that thought would be good to share. First of all, when you think about your operating model, it's a fairly significant effort to get alignment and understand what are some of the changes you're going to need to make from a process perspective, especially in a highly regulated environment. How do you address change control, incident management? And for us, we'll be running in a hybrid model because we still have some on-prem systems that will remain that are supporting some of our manufacturing operations on the shop floor. Next, make sure you engage your compliance teams early. This was a key for us because not only is all of this operating in the cloud and doing compliance differently new to us, it's also new to them. And so this was a very collaborative effort to get to this point. As we had to think differently. Also, manage your cost and think about managing your cost up front. We were able to take advantage of the savings plan programs and save over 20% on our infrastructure cost just up to this point, right? And we're through into our development environment. And then lastly, consider using dedicated accounts and VPCs for your SAP workloads. We initially tried to leverage our enterprise account and had a few challenges in terms of what our needs were to run an SAP platform. And so we were able to pivot fairly early in our program and move into this kind of a structure. So with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share where we are on our journey with SAP on AWS. We will be available outside the room, or I'll be available outside the room for any questions after the session, if anybody has questions. But next, I'm going to hand it over to Raj. He's got some exciting announcements that hear from reInvent around SAP on AWS, one of which we were able to participate in from a beta perspective, and pretty excited about some of the things that are coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you for sharing the lessons learned and the exciting things that are coming on Lily. All right, so from SAP on AWS updates perspective, these are the things that will allow you to utilize these AWS services in more meaningful manner than you have been doing in the past. Migration Hub Orchestrator is one of the services that will allow customers to simplify their migration needs from migrating either from on-prem to AWS or between AWS environments. Orchestrator as a service has an SAP-driven task that you can actually execute, and you have a single pane of glass of view of how that migration is happening, what are the tasks that is happening within the one console. On infrastructure side, there are a lot of features that were introduced from compute side, and then we have Milan-based EC2 instances that if you're not using, I would definitely encourage you to use. We virtualized the high memory EC2 instances from 18 terabytes to 24 terabytes now, which were bare metals before or dedicated hardware before. And then last but not least is the introduction of FSx ONTAP file systems, which is now certified to run SAP HANA on that. That actually now provides an opportunity for customers to set up a scale out HANA clusters within one availability zone. And with the introduction of auto host failover capabilities, introducing standby HANA database instance, which was not supported or provided earlier on an EBS-based storage mechanisms. FSx ONTAP file system can also be leveraged for SAP application side as well. So you can now have one set of storage solution for both the application as well as for the database needs, allowing you to have that full capabilities that SAP provides to make that infrastructure resilient. On innovation side, now we have a bi-directional data flows through AppFlow. And that actually allows you to extract data from SAP and stage it to other AWS services, from where you can actually do a lot of meaningful things like reporting, data analytics, and so on and so forth. And the one thing that we recently announced is the use of AWS SDK for SAP ABAP that brings the AWS innovations right into the SAP system. You write a very few lines of code, and from there, you can now interact with other AWS services. Think about a use case. We can use Stack Extract. We can generate the reports and stage it right into S3 bucket without any use of middlemen or middleware hardwares, right? And finally, on the management and operations side, if you are using Launch Wizard to launch SAP environments, now we have scale deployments. We can now do a clone deployment. So if you have one configuration that you have already used, you can clone that configuration without going through the entire 5 or 6 different pages. And finally, it now supports Solution Manager besides the NetWeaver stacks or SAP S/4HANA stacks with both SUSE and Red Hat operating system. Finally, we have a system manager support for SAP, and this is where the simplification comes in. So if you are leveraging AWS backend tool to back up your HANA database, there's a system manager or a solution already out there that you can just use it. The automation will allow you to set up the AWS backend interface for your HANA database. And finally, the observability metrics through a NetWeaver App Insight. So initially, we launched that capability for HANA databases, but now it looks for more than 30 different NetWeaver metrics that will allow you to have that single pane of view, monitoring everything from AWS, operating system, database, and SAP perspective in one dashboard, right? And that only requires a very simple setup, right? So you go into AWS console, identify the resource groups. So if you have not used it before, AWS resource groups, it's a really convenient way of assigning a specific tags to a set of EC2 instance based on a query that you perform. And you define that on all the app servers. For an example, you define resource groups for ECC application, you define another resource group for any other application, and then you can enable this NetWeaver metrics on a specific set of of those servers, right? It only requires, again, information about those resource groups. It automatically identifies that it's a NetWeaver stack, and it will try to manipulate all the logs for you and provide that in the CloudWatch Azure metrics. So these are all the features that we have introduced in the past. It's already out there. You can go in and check it out. The important one, of course, is the ABAP, right? SDK ABAP that we talked about. Doing a little bit of a deep dive, there are a lot of business process innovations that allows you to integrate with more than 300 services right from SAP. It reduces architectural complexity, right? So if you're using any other tools or or technologies, we are not relying on those, and it avoids the single point of failures. And finally, it's a security posture as well. So all the calls that happens between SAP and AWS services are encrypted, and it follows the same enforcement that you already have in place. And then, of course, it upskills your ABAP team. So time it takes to write down that complex code and logic, you don't have to spend a lot of time in integrating those services or logic with the AWS services. Using SDK, it provides a common pattern. It's an API call at the end, and we already have those documented for you on our web pages. Now, the exciting, I would say, service that we actually had an opportunity to work with Lily was the use of AWS Backup for HANA. And what that service does, initially, AWS Backup only supported solutions like EBS, EFS file systems, FSX file systems, but now it is actually a database-aware product. So it can identify a HANA database, and you can, within the AWS Backup, now you have the opportunity to define the same backup vault policies even for your HANA database as well. So we don't have to now define spatial schedules for HANA database. Backup scheduler that you have defined in backup service will be initialized automatically, and the HANA database will be backed up. Retention policies will be managed automatically as well, right? That reduces, of course, the complexity, the operations innovations that are required to maintain this complex environment. So, and of course, the important part is the restore, right? So if you are using a lot of different type of backup recovery tools, it's sometimes pretty hard to get hold of a spatial resources who only knows how to do the restore. So it reduces, again, the complexity involved in terms of refreshing your QA environments, or even doing a regular restore as part of your monthly cycles, right? And it supports various AWS services, as you can see on the screen. Now, if you want to begin, of course, your journey from SAP on AWS perspective, there are a lot of partners available, which we actually qualify them as a competency partner. I'm part of professional services, so you can always engage professional services to help simplify your journey. And finally, of course, explore the migration acceleration programs that AWS offers, because that will reduce not only the cost, but it also simplifies the way you can actually operate SAP on AWS. And with that said, I would actually like to thank you all for attending today's session. As what Ryan mentioned, myself and Ryan will be outside. If you have any questions, if you want to deep dive on any of the services that we have talked about, I'll be more than happy to share that feedback. And of course, don't forget the surveys. It are really important for us to make sure the contents are well defined and we can actually provide better content next time. And with that said, thank you so much once again for joining today's session.